Greetings and welcome to ED621A. This is Module 1, and in Module 1 we're going to unpack standards, create transfer goals, and design measurable objectives for a single content area set of 2 UBD Understanding by Design lesson plans. As a reminder of what backwards design is for this course, it's first important because if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there? You're starting from where you want students to be and then designing instruction to get them there. In order to do this, there are 3 stages that we've mentioned in the orientation. Stage 1, establishing the desired goal, which is derived from the standards, which you're going to be doing for this module. Stage 2 will be designing the evidence of learning, what the sources of evidence are that will show you the students have learned. And stage 3, setting up the actual learning experiences for the students to get them to the goal and then to the standard. You can see a picture of the framework that this is based on in Carol Ann Tomlinson's and Jay Mattai's book on page 36, and also in your Understanding by Design book. The book is pretty much designed around this framework. Unpacking standards. So the essential question for unpacking standards: what is worth teaching and assessing? Your curriculum in schools all have a certain scope and sequence that are based on or aligned with the state standards, and those standards are what those lessons are then built from. They often include, if the curriculum is well written, long-term transfer goals, overarching understandings, overarching essential questions, and recurring cornerstone tasks, which are assessments you're not going to be making cornerstone tasks per se, but you're going to be making some other assessments that are important to the learning of the students. The first step for unpacking standards is to really review them. First, start by what you know students need to know. What is designated for your grade level? What is designated for the content area that you're teaching? Careful reading of these documents to ensure clarity about how it all fits together so that you know where you're going and where you want the students to go. Because if you don't know where you're going, the students are definitely not going to know where you're going. To make transfer goals from standards, this is where we are. You choose your standard and then you make your transfer goals. The goals are still broad. The goals identify the effective uses of the content, understanding, knowledge, and skills that you seek in the long run from the standards. The goals lead to or point to what you want students to be able to know and to do when they confront new challenges both in and outside of school. So your objectives that are drawn from the goals will hopefully be applicable not just in an in-school situation, but outside. Knowledge that they'll be able to use as thinkers and learners outside of school. So we're going to look at a math standard. We're going to unpack this one as an example. So the standard comes for the measurement and data for grade 4. So your content area on your lesson plan framework is measurement and data. The topic of the lesson is specific to whatever you're going to be teaching, and that comes a little bit later after you've designed your goals and objectives. So the standard says to solve problems involving measurement and conversion of measurements from a larger unit to a smaller unit and involving time. Now clearly this standard is applicable grades K-12. What does it look like for grade 4? This standard may suggest a goal such as the student will be able to use math they know to solve messy, never seen before problems using effective mathematical reasoning. And you'll note this is a process goal. This isn't a content goal so much. And the reason it's a process goal is because it's connected this whole concept of solving problems with transferring it to never before seen problems using the content of whatever it is you're teaching. So this is a process goal, and probably not as useful to you as a content goal would be, but all the same, it is applicable. Now, this is something very important to note, and I have our minion, Beto, giving you the warning. When the standards include thinking or doing that is very difficult or impossible to measure or explain, Why is that important? It's okay for a standard because a standard covers, a whole generation of students, basically. Terms like know, understand, appreciate, think about, learned in a goal and an objective, don't use them. When writing goals and objectives, don't use these terms. What does it mean to know? What does it look like to understand? You'll always be asked to rewrite if you use know and understand as a thinking verb in goals, objectives, or assessments. I will say this is not an active verb. Please use your Bloom's taxonomy. Know and understand are vague. There are many ways to know and understand. Which way do you mean? What does it look like? If you have the answer, that's the verb you use. What does it mean to appreciate? How do you know when someone appreciates? How do you measure appreciation? Music appreciation involves a recognition, for example, of the way something is composed or the emotions that it elicits, or I can't think of anything off the top of my head any further than that. But what does it look like? So how do you describe what you want? And those are the verbs you use. Don't give me the word appreciate. Or recognize. There are many ways to recognize something. You can identify it, you can describe it, you can explain it. Use those verbs. Determine what you really are looking for, what you really want the students to know and do, and use that verb. Your Bloom's taxonomy, as I mentioned, is very handy. Please use it. We'll be using it definitely in B, but if you haven't used it in A, you want to use it when you're designing your lessons. So let's unpack a standard. Let's really go through this. When we unpack a standard, we make sure the verbs are defined and can be measured. It can be easily understood by students and families. The learning is relevant, and it's something important, authentic, beyond the students' immediate interests or culture. It's global. It goes beyond hay, collecting hay in a hayfield. It goes, what is important about collecting hay in a hayfield? Why is it important for? Who is it important for? Who uses the hay? And so on. So what is worth teaching and assessing? So here's a standard. This is a citizenship standard. A student should have the knowledge and skills necessary to participate effectively as an informed and responsible citizen. They should know the important characteristics of citizenship, and they should recognize that it is important for citizens to fulfill their public responsibilities. This is very nonspecific and general. No surprises here. This is the standard. The standard has these very vague terms. For you, the teacher, your goal is to narrow it down into actionable, measurable goals and objectives. How do we know they know this? How do we know they recognize it? How do they participate effectively? So this also comes, this content standard, with some performance indicators. And you'll see this more with science, science mostly, and science standards that you find, somewhat in social studies, somewhat in math, and even in language arts, that you'll have a set of performance indicators. These are very close to goals, but they're not goals. Why not? Let's take a look and see. These performance indicators, let's look at the first one. Be able to exercise political participation by discussing public issues, building consensus, becoming involved in political parties and political campaigns, and voting. Whew. Lots of information there. So many action verbs. So these performance indicators are still part of the standard. They're not goals. Goals will narrow this down and specify even further. Number 2 says be able to establish, explain, and apply useful criteria useful in evaluating rules and laws. Same. Many verbs. Too many for just one goal. Number 3, be able to establish, explain, and apply criteria useful in selecting political leaders. Too many verbs. Gotta narrow it down. Break it up. You're unpacking it. You're tearing it apart. You're deconstructing it. Deconstructing is a wonderful word. I love that word. Recognize the value of community service, which is only one verb, but notice that it uses the word recognize. We don't use the word recognize in our goals or our objectives, because what does that mean? How do I know they recognize it? How am I going to measure that? So recognize is not a verb that we can use in our goals and objectives, but it definitely gives us a direction to go, which is what performance indicators are for. They give us direction. And to be able to implement ways of solving problems and resolving conflict. Again, more verbs, lots of process. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about objectives. So these are still guidance. They're not specific enough for a transfer goal, the goal that transfers what they learn into a larger context. So in thinking about the standard, the verbs are underlined in purple, and it's from these verbs that you will create your goals and objectives. So we want to rewrite the standard into a transfer goal that's student family friendly and has clear action verbs. And then these verbs will be used to write your objectives from the transfer goal. So here's our standard again. A student should have the knowledge and skills necessary to participate effectively as an informed citizen and informed and responsible citizen. Know the important characteristics of citizenship. Recognize that it's important for citizens to fulfill their public responsibilities. Still our big, giant standard. Now you've unpacked them and the performance indicators, and we have created transfer goals using the performance indicators as guidance. I want you to notice the kind of verbs that are used. A student can explain the important characteristics of citizenship. This is still broad, but your lesson will pull it in. What are they going to explain? They can measure it. You can measure this. They will be able to explain the characteristics. What are the characteristics? How are you going to have them explain it will be part of your assessment. And the goals and assessments are intimately related. A student can explain the value of community service and maybe will participate in community service activities. That can be a more specific goal. A student can apply criteria to evaluate rules and laws. So you have certain criteria you're going to give them, and using these criteria, they're going to evaluate the rules and laws so that this is more specific enough that you can make measurable objectives with it. Can discuss issues in order to build consensus. What does building consensus look like? How are they going to discuss it? These can be measured. A student can apply strategies to solve problems and resolve conflict. Clearly a measurable goal. You can make objectives measuring this goal. A student can research a candidate on relevant criteria and to inform their voting choices during an election. Again, and you notice the student can, it's like this is where you want to go. The student will be able to do these things. This is not an objective, but at the end the student will be able to do this. Student can explain. They can do these things, and in the larger context of their lives. So make it simple. Notice that the transfer goals are still broad, but can much more easily be transformed into measurable objectives due to the use of action verbs. And also notice that they are narrowed down to a specific area of study, very specific content. The multiple tasks seen in the performance indicators are separated out so the goal is not as complex. So you're reducing complexity, you're making it simple. And eventually will help you effectively scaffold the learning experiences, which is where we're going with this. This whole thing is developing a learning experience for students. So when we unpack the standards, they're easily understood by students, easily understood by families, broad enough to cover a range of content in the area of study, specific enough to be aligned and transformed into measurable objectives. So we are here. This is your lesson plan template. What you're going to do is complete this top part. When you've decided what your standard and your goal are, you can fill in the content area, and most likely you'll be able to identify the topic of the lesson, but you can wait on that until you get more specific down into your objectives, which you're going to do next. So these are the two sections that you want to fill out right now. So for the next steps, you need to, of course, read assigned course text as well as the materials in Module 1 that you find. After you've selected and unpacked your content standard and created a transfer goal based on it, you're going to complete those sections in the lesson plan template. And then you're going to view the next screencast on designing measurable objectives, which is the other part of the assignment for this module, Module 1. And you complete that section, and then you'll submit all the completed sections of your lesson plan template to the assignment Dropbox. Don't submit your work until you've completed it all, because you'll have to resubmit it. So right now, get started on unpacking your standards and creating your transfer goals. And then the next step will be, of course, designing your objectives based on those.